Lots of houses, particularly farmhouses, would have had a range of some sort, but this is just an open fire, and from what we can see here, there never has been a range as such.
If they wanted a servant, they would have pressed it or pulled the cord. The bell would have rung down here where the servants were, so the bell is very much dictated, the servant's life. You hear the bell, you have to go running.
Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Exploring Island Heritage. Today we're finding out more about contrasting ways of life in the Isle of Man in days gone by. First, we head north to meet Curator of Social History for Manx National Heritage, Matthew Richardson, to find out more about the Grove Museum in Ramsey.
The Grove's a family house. The Gibb family lived here over several generations, and it started off being a summer home. The family were originally from Liverpool, but they moved permanently to the Isle of Man, and it became their family home, the seat of all their memories. And when the two Gibb sisters, two spinster sisters that lived here in the 1970s, grew old, they couldn't face seeing the house perhaps being broken up for flats or even demolished, and arranged for it to come into the care of Manx National Heritage.
So you've transformed it into a museum. I mean, what snapshot of history does it capture?
Well, loosely speaking, it's sort of set up as it might have appeared around about, say, 1900. When we acquired the house, it was full of 100 years of possessions, clothes, furniture, clutter, for want of a better word. So the curators at the time, back in 1974, had quite a task on their hands re-establishing the house as it might have appeared, and indeed filtering through all this material to sort out what was relevant for display and what wasn't, what we should put in storage and what we shouldn't. So it took them 2 years really to get the house looking reasonably presentable. Well, what they did find, what they were very fortunate, is in several parts of the house it had been almost completely untouched. So you see wallpapers that would have been there in the 1840s or 50s, you see furniture there that would have been around the same time, and in some cases we've even got photographs of the interior as it appeared in the Gibbs' childhood. So we know that we're on pretty safe ground when we reconstruct some of these rooms as to what they would have appeared like.
I suppose with this you've got quite a lot of documentation, so you can piece things together.
Indeed, this is a fabulously well documented family because they left everything to us, lock, stock and barrel, and that includes family albums, family archives, letters, paperwork, albums. And it's true to say that we're still exploring those today. We're still going through them, and they're still providing us with information as to how the house appeared, the history of the house, its development, things like that. So that's a huge resource and a huge asset to come with the house.
What can you see when you come here?
Let's go inside.
What is the house itself typical of?
Well, it's typical of a kind of large to medium mansion that the well-to-do Manx would have lived in the 19th century, and it's an interesting location in the island. Here to the north of Ramsey, there were a number of important local families like the Krellins at Ballacurry who mixed together, who socialised together. So it represents that kind of not aristocracy as such, but gentry, if you like, that you would have found in the Isle of Man in the later part of the 19th century. Here we are in the dining room. It's one of the best rooms in the house, really, because it's so well preserved. Once some of that clutter that had built up over many, many years was cleared, the curators back in the 70s found that we've got original wallpaper here, which has been on these walls probably since at least 1850, and a lot of the original furniture set up in the room. And with so many of the objects, there's a story that goes with them. For example, the skeleton clock on the mantelpiece there, which was a wedding present for the Gibbs' grandparents. So many other artefacts that we can find. For example, when they sold up their property in Liverpool, some of them appear in inventories for that. So we can tell interesting stories about quite a lot of the items here.
So how do you decide how to present it to the public?
Well, you might think that it's static, something that we're presenting a Victorian house as it would have appeared at a certain date. So to some extent, it's not like other museums where the displays change regularly. By its very nature, it doesn't change very much. But having said that, the emphasis here has shifted certainly since we first acquired the property, because in the mid-70s it was very fashionable. Every museum service in Britain had a Victorian house. It was one thing of those things you had to have, to represent the Victorians. And the original interpretation panels back then would have said something like, the Victorians did this, it was typical of a Victorian house to have that. It was very much about how the Victorians as a group lived. What we've tried to do in more recent years is to reintroduce the Gibb family, because we're so fortunate to have this archive, to have these recordings, memories. The family is so well documented that we can actually reintroduce them to the house and to our visitors. So we've tried to present more of the stories of the Gibb sisters growing up here, two little girls growing up with their grandmother and their aunt, being schooled at home, mixing with the other well-to-do families in the north of Ramsey, going on picnics, which is what Edwardian girls did, All of those stories are in there, and we're trying to draw them out and present the more human aspect to the house.
There does seem to be an unusual element to the story, maybe even a sadness.
Some people might question why the sisters never married, why they never moved away from the house, why they lived their whole life here, really with just each other toward the end. A lot of people have sought to answer that question. One of the stories that comes out of reading the family papers is that one of the sisters was certainly more independent than the other. One was much more into travel. She went away and came back several times. The sister that stayed, it said her aunt put a lot of pressure on her not to leave her as she grew older. You must never leave the grove, you must never leave the house, you must always stay here and look after it, and you must promise me that you will never marry. So that's perhaps one element in it. Another aspect of this is, of course, these girls grew up in a time of great turmoil around about the time of the First World War. So perhaps many of the men who might have been suitors were killed in that war. Certainly we know that they weren't. Alice Gibb in particular had a number of male friends she wrote to. That's evidenced by her correspondence. None of these friendships ever turned into marriage, and certainly a lot of these men seem to have got caught up in the First World War, and even if they weren't killed, they certainly seem to have come back changed by it. So perhaps it was partly family circumstance that they never married. Perhaps it was external circumstances at the time they lived. But certainly the two sisters were very close right through their lives and remained here, in the house till the time of their death. So here we are in the main bedroom of the house. This is an interesting part of the house because when Duncan Gibb, the girl's grandfather, first came across the Grove, he was travelling in the Isle of Man on business. It was a small stone-built sea captain's cottage, but Duncan Gibb had great ambition for it, knew that he could turn it into a very comfortable summer home for his family, and he commissioned an architect to build a house around a house. So the part of the house we're in at the moment, he built onto the front, and this was the imposing edifice that visitors would see as they came up the drive toward the house. So this part of it was built very much for show. You've got the two downstairs rooms, the dining room and the drawing room, and then upstairs the quite impressive main bedrooms. And we're in one of those now, and again it illustrates the richness of the contents of the house that we acquired when it came into Manx National Heritage care, and we've set out the room as it might have appeared in a typical day, late Victorian, Edwardian era, with the family suitcase open, the washstand, of course, which would have been very familiar to many, many people years gone by in the days before, running water when a maid would have brought each morning a jug of hot water from the kitchen, poured it into the bowl so that the family could have a morning wash. This was all part of the routine of a well-to-do house.
And interestingly, a couple of animal skins here, so it's very much of its time.
Absolutely.
I suppose there would be a lot around
Absolutely. This family had connections with the empire. They had relatives in India. It would be no surprise to find that they'd got tiger skins or leopard skins in the house. Would have been fairly typical for a family of this sort of status.
And would there be a fireplace in every room?
Yes, there would, and it would have been the maid's job to get those fires going. I mean, there was a huge amount of work involved in running a house like this, colossal amount. This is one of the aspects that people today, with all our labour-saving gadgets, our washing machines, our dishwashers, things like that, running, even quite a large house is a fairly straightforward operation. In Victorian times, families with a large house like this relied very much on cheap labour. It was young unmarried women that came into the house as maidservants, and they would be doing menial tasks from very early in the morning till very late at night. And one of those would be first thing in the morning preparing the fires in the house, because everything was solid fuel, no gas, no electricity. In the winter, you'd have to get every fire in the house going, 6 in the morning or whatever, to get them nice and warm, ready for when the family awoke. Washing was all done by hand. Drying done with a mangle. Everything was extremely labour intensive, and it could only be done with this large amount of available cheap labour. And one of the reasons why larger houses went into abeyance after the First World War, of course, was that supply of cheap labour dried up. Wage costs had gone up, and it became very difficult to run a large house in the way that people had done in the Victorian times. And that was certainly noticeable in the Grove, when we see through census returns year on year, the number of staff in the house reducing. So one of the recent developments we've undertaken at the Grove, we did a little bit of research into what had previously been called the toy room, and we came to the conclusion that this was probably one of the live-in servants' rooms. And the reason we came to that conclusion is because of a small sketched picture of a ship scratched into one of the window panes with a name underneath it, Sarah Callister, who we believe was one of the servants here. So from that we deduced this was probably the servants' room, and we decided to set that out. In contrast to the sort of well-to-do nature of the rest of the house, we presented it as a servants' room might have appeared, very sparse, very Spartan, and undertook quite a bit of research into what the life of a servant in a house like this would have been. And it would have been very different, if upstairs, downstairs doesn't really sort of begin to cover it. The contrast between the well-to-do family and their staff is quite interesting.
Again, you say it's a very busy life. It would be probably quite a harsh life. Do you have any sense of what kind of bosses the people who owned the house would be?
I think in the case of the Grove, they were, very interested in their staff. We get a sense of that from the recordings that we've got and from the letters. They were very benevolent towards their staff. It certainly didn't treat them in any harsh way. But it was a fact of life that this was, again, the Victorian ethos. You got the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. That was the Victorian outlook. Some people were born to be the masters, and some people were born to be the servants, and that was God's way. And who was to question it? So the Victorians didn't trouble themselves too much about inequality in the same way that we do today. You hear a lot of that in the news, the equality in society. Well, Victorians accepted it.
In the kitchen, there's an interesting array of things here. I mean, you were talking about how much work there would be for the servants, basically, the workers here. Presumably all of this represents what they'd be using.
Yeah, absolutely. We're standing in front of the kitchen range, which was, the centrepiece of the kitchen. It would have been kept lit winter and summer. It was the main source of hot water for the house, main source of cooking. Clothes would have been dried using the heat that came from it. So again, one of the main tasks of the servants would be to keep this thing fed with fuel, with wood, to keep it burning, but also to keep it clean. Blackleading the range was an ongoing task, again, repeated day in, day out, to keep the thing in tip-top condition. So another illustration of the sort of back-breaking hard work that the servants would have had to do. But the real tour de force in this part of the house would have been the cook. And the cook was, in any Victorian house, was among the senior servants, held quite a lot of sway over the other lesser mortals in the behind-stairs area. And at the start of each day, probably the lady of the house would have come down to the kitchen to discuss with the cook the meals for the day, what was going to be prepared. The cook would probably advise on what she thought. Food would be ordered, and food would be delivered from the various shops in Ramsey. A delivery boy would come not to the front door of the house, not to the main imposing frontage of the house, which was for the family's important visitors, but instead to the back door of the house here in the scullery, just outside the kitchen. So that is where all your deliveries of meat and other provisions would have been supplied on account, of course. Monthly accounts would have been settled with a bill sent from a provisions merchant to the family. They would have ordered in meat and provisions like that, but vegetables would probably have been grown locally in the grounds of the house. We know this because old Garrett, the gardener, is referred to quite a lot in the family's accounts. We have a list of seeds that he was buying for the kitchen garden, so we know what sort of things that he was growing, cabbages, onions, things like that.
And is that typical of the era, that people would be to a degree self-sufficient in that way?
Yeah, indeed. One of the other aspects here is that they kept pigs, which was very common. And pigs are one of the things that Miss Gibb makes, one of the points she makes, is that every Manx farm or house of any great standing would have had pigs in this area, because pigs are very good recycling machines. All your household scraps, waste, whatever, goes to the pigs. They clear it all away for you, and every now and again you get some bacon. So pigs are a very efficient way of making use of the things that you no longer need.
And one thing in the kitchen here you can see a range of bells. What were they for?
Well, the bell was something that dictated life in a house like this. Every room in the house, or certainly the rooms that the family used, would have had a call bell, a button or whatever. If they wanted a servant, they would have pressed it or pulled the cord. The bell would have rung down here where the servants were, and they would be able to tell which room in the house the bell was ringing from, so they'd have to go up there and see what the matter was, what they were required for. So the bells very much dictated, the servant's life. You hear the bell, you have to go running.
So is this the back door that people would come in?
This is the scullery where the delivery boys would come, bringing the goods.
So there really was a separation. I mean, where did the servants live?
Well, as I say, some lived in that room upstairs, others would have lived locally in surrounding houses. You definitely had to have some staff living in because so many of the duties, you needed to be on site. Starting those fires off early in the morning, the family needed servants more or less 24 hours a day, so you'd have to have some living in, even if others came in during the day and went away again. But the Grove was a small working farm. One of the things that attracted Duncan Gibb when he retired from business in Liverpool to come to the Grove was the fact that he could set himself up as a small, prosperous farmer. And at one time, the Grove lands were much more extensive than they are today. Duncan Gibb had quite a number of acres, not just around Ramsey, but also in the Laxey area as well, Lonnan. And as the family fell on hard times, as years went by, they survived by selling off parcels of land. So the Grove estate, as it's come down to us today, is much diminished from what it was in Duncan Gibb's day. But one of the things that he was very interested in was modern techniques of farming, and he liked to think of himself as a modern-minded, forward-thinking farmer. And one of the things that he had brought over to the Isle of Man was this threshing mill, which he brought over from Scotland, which at the time was quite an innovative thing. It would be driven by a horse outside, with the horse walking around chained to the bar, would have driven the machinery here inside the threshing mill, and that would have threshed the corn that came from his fields.
Farming itself would be pretty dangerous. I mean, it's a dangerous industry anyway.
Well, it was a hard life working the land. If you were a farm labourer, again, the hours would be long and the wages very, very basic. Duncan Gibb would have had many people working for him on his land. Probably on a seasonal basis. People were hired in. They weren't employed on a regular basis. They'd be hired in each year, not hiring fair or whatever. So you didn't have a great deal of security of employment.
Right, that's the whole Hollandtide season.
Yeah, exactly.
Curator of Social History for Manx National Heritage, Matthew Richardson. You're listening to Exploring Island Heritage, and on this week's programme we're finding out about contrasting ways of life in the island in days gone by. In Onchan, a far more basic way of life is showcased in Molly Corroin's cottage. Built in the 1700s, the cottage is furnished to reflect basic 19th century life in the village and is used to tell the story of one of its former inhabitants. It's looked after and open to the public by members of the Friends of Onchan's Heritage. Keith Watterson is the group's chair and Keren Corkill is the vice chair.
Well, we're looking at a cottage that's approximately 300 years old, not originally built as a cottage but as a weaving shed, but converted and lived in, believe it or not, although it's very small in size. There was a family living in here until the time of Second World War. So quite compact and cosy.
And there have been some structural changes to it over the years. It was converted into a dwelling.
Yes, it was a weaving shed at one time, and as such didn't have a chimney. So the chimney breast that we can see on the right hand side here was actually constructed on the outside so that it gave more room inside, didn't take that room up from the living accommodation. Unfortunately we can't light the fire at the moment, but it was the only source of heat for the building.
And they raised the roof because it was a thatched roof, because they needed to make, and this is the Crow family, I ought to say, who had the weaving shed, and they obviously needed more accommodation, so they made their weaving shed into this dwelling and raised the roof by taking the thatch off and then making an area at the top, which was typical in little Manx cottages, like a mezzanine area for the children to sleep in. We haven't a ladder here for obvious reasons, but they would have got up there by the ladder and kept warm. So I imagine it was quite cosy. The wall's very thick.
There's no water, there's no electricity, there's no gas, there's no sewerage, and never has been. So children are quite amazed when they come in with their parents these days about the lack of facilities.
Can we go inside and have a look at the layout inside?
I suppose the main focal point is the fireplace here, the cholk, that would have provided a bit of light and heat, but also a cooking facility. There's no other cooking facility at all, say no electric, no gas, so everything would have been done on the open fire. Lots of houses, particularly farmhouses, would have had a range of some sort, but this is just an open fire, and from what we can see here, there never has been a range as such in this cottage.
I mean, we have equipped it with cooking utensils so that we could imagine how they would cook their food, and the water, of course, they used to get from the well and the pumps in the village in those days, And in fact, the cottage is dedicated to Molly Corrooin, who lived here from around about the 1880s right through to 1914. The furniture we have here is very simple. We have been advised by the Manx Museum, and it would have been as it probably was. I mean, obviously, Molly's obviously taken what was here with her to her house in St Catherine's Terrace, where she finished her life. But it's very simple and very plain, but they managed to live their lives here for, as I said, 30 years.
There's not a lot to it. It's simple. As Keren said, hard work for those who are here, for the mother of the house, but everybody would muck in. Children would be expected to go out and gather firewood, because they wouldn't be able to afford coal, so water would have to be fetched in, sanitation had to be dealt with. It's okay saying she did washing, but all of that water had to be carted in, it then had to be heated. The old dirty water had to be thrown away as well. So lots of hard work, so you'd need lots of hands to help. And I think probably children and families did more so then, got stuck in, than they would do today.
Well, the cottage itself is partitioned off, and we're now in the bedroom area of the cottage, fairly narrow space, but the walls are quite interesting. There's something significant about it.
Yes, there are a couple of little alcoves in the walls. There's one by the head of the bed here, which is probably about a foot square, but then round to the left here on the gable wall of the cottage there is an alcove set back into the wall. It's probably sort of about 300 millimetres deep, but it's sort of square in shape, isn't it? Probably about 450, 500 millimetres tall and wide, and we just use it to sort of display a little photograph or two and a candle, but it's been at one time a window through to the outside, and we'll see outside in a minute on the gable end where that outside was, because here the bottom of that former window is probably sort of waist height above the floor, but outside it's at ground level because of the difference in the heights of the ground.
We go out and have a look?
Yep, we'll go out and have a look. The window that we spoke about inside is down here now. This is it here. There's a lintel running across there to support the weight of the wall, and you can see running down here in a vertical direction is the left hand side of the window, and the other side there you can see in the stone there's a line going down for the right hand side, and the bottom of the window is down there at ground level.
So the cottage really is down in a dip.
It is. It's the ground here is probably sort of about 2'6" higher than the foundations, but it's pretty dry, and it's not rendered, of course, it's just open stone work, but the stones are laid in such a way that the water runs out and off rather than running in, and then it's treated with whitewash, which is a natural substance, and it allows the building to breathe.
And you've been doing quite a lot of research on this. You found out some interesting facts about Molly herself.
Well, I did, because we didn't really know very much about her, only hearsay and stories that had gone down through the last, 50 years. It turns out that Molly Corrooin isn't Molly Corrooin, she's Anne Corrooin, and I had some trouble finding her on the census, that's for sure. Our conservation officer, Peter Kelly, who many people will know, of course, was looking in the museum, researching something else, and came up with an article which was written 1880, and the vicar of Onchan, Parson Howe, was very furious because Molly Corrooin, now we know as Annie, whose husband had died only weeks before, leaving her with 5 children, had found that she and the older children were begging. Well, this was a slight on the vicar because, of course, he was, and his wardens, providing Molly with help. Because he'd said at the graveside of her husband, who died when he was 37, that he would look after her, and of course he said that she shouldn't be begging, and it sort of reflected badly on him. So that was one article. Meanwhile, there's a report about Annie standing up and saying, well, what he was hearing wasn't the truth, and she didn't mind standing up for herself. So yes, and then just to finish off, she had a brother called Thomas, who wasn't in her life at all as an adult. He'd gone off to America, I think he was in his 30s, and travelled from New York to Texas, and he settled in Bell County. Well, he remained single. I think he was a labourer, and then he managed to accrue enough money and managed to get himself a small farm holding. He died in 1912. Meanwhile, Molly's still living here, and a newspaper announced the fact that this Onchan woman had been left a legacy. A legacy amounted to £3,000 because it was a lot of money. If it was translated today, it would be hundreds of thousands of pounds. So all of a sudden, she's not poor anymore. She can pay her own rent. And I can't imagine how she coped with it. She had to make a will, and sadly, she only enjoyed this windfall for a short time because she died in 1914, by which time she'd moved to St Catherine's Terrace, but still paying rent. But she was able to leave money to her daughters and to a grandchild and a son who was living away. So it's a quite a nice ending, but it's sad too that she didn't feel the benefit of being able to support herself all those years.
And she lived until she was
She did.
69.
Yeah.
So, it wasn't a bad age, was
No,
it?
considering she'd had a tough life.
She had a tough life, yeah. But,
So we've now found out a lot about the cottage, but now we know so much more about the incumbent, and it's enriched it really. So we feel that it's what we'd like to call living history really. It's not just in a story. We could walk in here and see, well, this is where she lived and this is how she lived. And I think it makes it much more inspiring for people who are visiting.
Chair of Friends of Onchan's Heritage, Keith Watterson, and Vice Chair Keren Corkill. That's it for this week's programme. We'll be exploring more island heritage at the same time next week.